This conference will now be recorded.
Hello. In this episode of The Babbling Professor, I want to take a look at a theme and a pattern instead of a specific event or person. It seems to me that when we look at women in history, specifically political women in history, I'm not talking about cultural or social or literary leaders. I'm specifically talking about political women in history and current events. One of the patterns we see is that women are often judged by their masculinity, like that they act male in order to be successful, and that somehow that's either a compliment or an insult, depending on the situation. And then there's unfortunately the uglier end side of this, when women are successful politically, there's usually a pushback by the male um, narratives of history that there's something dysfunctional about their sexuality, or that somehow they have compromised their moral integrity through their sexual behaviors. And it's interesting to me that that's the takedown of women throughout history, because you don't see the same litmus test being used against male leaders in history. It's as old as time, that this idea that a sexually active man is cool and should be admired, and the in the exact same breath that a sexually active woman is somehow impure and has done something wrong. Look no further than Henry VIII, who we all know was married 6 times in total, many more mistresses, and yet he's not described in sexually deviant ways. He's made fun of, sure, in the narratives of history, and you raise your eyebrow, but it's not the same. It's not the same judgment that gets applied to successful women in history, and the questions that immediately pop up about their sexuality, whether it be his own daughter Elizabeth, who's known as the Virgin Queen, whether it's Catherine the Great of Russia, even if it's you go back to Hatshepsut, where she was successfully ruling ancient Egypt, and rumors and graffiti um, popped up concurrently and historically, questioning her relationship with one of the advisors. So let's take a look at and a listen at this list that I came up with. These are my 20 phenomenal females in history, and at the end, I'll share with you a couple of honorable mentions as well. But going forward, these are my heroes. These are my heroines of history. These are women that I think were incredible rulers in their own right. I mentioned already Hatshepsut. She was a pharaoh, the first or second historically confirmed female pharaoh in ancient Egypt. Officially, she ruled jointly with her son after her husband died, but she effectively ruled Egypt through her son. She inherited. She became regent when her son was about 2 years old, but she kept him in place and truly ruled Egypt herself for the rest of her life. Egyptologist James Henry Breasted actually said this: Hatshepsut is the first great woman in history that we are all informed of. Meaning prior to her, there was rumors and mythology, but we know Hatshepsut was a historical woman who ruled. Another ancient Egyptian pharaoh who ruled was Nefertiti. She ruled with her husband, Akhenaten, and they're famous for their religious revolution of worshiping only one God. But what it might be less known is that she and her husband ruled through as co-regents through arguably the wealthiest period of Egyptian history. Now, if you say the word Nefertiti, what comes up typically is people talk about how beautiful she was. How come we don't talk about her political acumen and the fact that here was a successful woman that ruled, not a consort, but a true co-regent. Finally, out of Egypt is Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. Cleopatra is the descendant of the great Ptolemy. She was the pharaoh of Egypt during a time where Egypt was losing, right? They were being pressed by the what was the Roman Republic, later the Roman Empire. She used her position and her sexuality to buy her country more time. She became a partner for Caesar. She had a son, whether it was Caesar's or not is questionable, but she thought it was Caesar's and or convinced Caesar that it was Caesar's, and her son named Caesarion. Um, Bought her an alliance with Caesar, and when Caesar was assassinated, she moved on and found another political military leader that could preserve Egyptian independence in Mark Antony. Now, obviously, she and Mark Antony lost the Battle of Actium, and that was the end of Cleopatra. But the point is, here's a young woman who had inherited the throne from her parents. She was actually supposed to be co-ruler with her brother. She eliminated her brother and tried to preserve her country the best she could. That country, who eventually took over Egypt, of course, is Rome. And it was Caesar's nephew, biologically, his adopted son, Augustus, who became the first Roman emperor. What's less known, though, is that Augustus didn't have children of his own, that he married Livia, and Livia brought her children into the marriage. And Livia became his most trusted advisor. She's the mother. So here's Livia marries the first Caesar. She's the mother of the second Caesar. She's the grandmother of the third Caesar. She's the grandmother of the fourth Caesar, and she's the great great grandmother of the fifth Caesar. The Julio Claudio or Claudio Julio dynasty is Livia. She's a woman who ruled, maybe not in her own right, but behind the scenes. Theodora, on the other hand, from the Eastern Empire, what becomes known as the Byzantine Empire, she didn't rule behind the scenes. She was a very public co-ruler with her husband, Emperor Justinian, which created pushback, right? Historically, men don't like women in power, unless they're women in power that the men think they can manipulate. And you can't manipulate Theodora. And so while we do know that she came from a low birth, because she became an influential and powerful woman in history, that rumors immediately started that not that she was just from a low birth, but that she was a former prostitute that was rose up through the ranks. Like immediately that it's not that she's savvy or political or intelligent, or God forbid that she and her husband actually like each other, that there must be something like almost manipulative about her sexuality. This is the same like concept behind accusing women of being witches, right? That somehow there's a seductive force or a curse or a spell, that somehow these women are doing things that they shouldn't be able to do or shouldn't just do, period, right? This is the hypocrisy of history, and we need more herstory. Empress Wu out in the East Asia, she, in this time period, roughly around the year 700 CE, here's a woman, she's the only female sovereign recognized in Chinese history. What I mean by that is all of the other female rulers were consorts or regents, right? She's recognized as a reigning empress in her own right, a sovereign. In fact, her dynasty, the Zhao, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is wedged right in between the Tang. She replaced the Tang dynasty, and when she died, the Tang dynasty came back. I think of her as almost being like a female Chinese version of Charlemagne, right? This idea that a nation state was created around a person, a persona, and not even a dynasty or a nation state with defined borders. The Empress Wu ruled. Back in Europe, Matilda lived in a period that's known as the anarchy. And everyone in her life was a Henry. Her dad was King Henry the First of England. When she was growing up, she was betrothed and eventually married Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, out in Germany. He installed her as his region of the Italian peninsula. So she was given political power by her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor. So he obviously recognized her ability and skills. Unfortunately, her brother died, making her the heir, which was not very popular with the Norman royal family of England. And remember, in this time period, England owns like western and southern France, essentially, from Normandy down towards Aquitaine. So Her dad spent the rest of his life trying to ensure that Matilda would become the reigning queen after him. Well, he died and they didn't accept her. So what did she do? She invaded England proper, across the Channel, and took over almost, well, roughly all of England. Her rival controlled Cornwall and Wales, but she ruled England. When she went to crown herself, though, in London, there was pushback by even some of her supporters, so she took the title Lady of England. And I just can't help think that if you ruled about 70+% of England and you controlled the capital of London and you were male, I have a feeling people would not object to you putting a crown on your head. Matilda continued to rule England until she died, and she passed that along to her son, Henry II. So again, everybody in her life was a Henry, and everybody was a king. Everybody was a sovereign except for her, which again begs the question of why are women rulers looked at differently? One of the women that you can't keep down, you can't deny, is Eleanor of Aquitaine. When she was born, she was raised in the Duchy of Aquitaine. She inherited it when her dad died, and she was, again, to use this word, a sovereign. She was the sovereign of Aquitaine in her own right. Aquitaine at that time period was almost at least a quarter, almost a third of France. It was a really wealthy part of Europe. And so it made her a very desirable marriage partner for her property. But what people didn't realize is again, I'm going to use the word acumen, the political acumen that this woman had. She was married to the King of France, meaning the King of France inherited it through marriage, rather. He took her property, and then when he was done with her, he divorced her, and she took her property back. This is a woman who ruled. So the King of France lost that property, and the King of France's rival, the King of England, said, I think I'd like not just your ex-wife, but I think I'd like Aquitaine too. And so she married Henry of England, and they had several children, the most famous children being, well, we all know Richard the Lionheart, we know Geoffrey, and we know John, who becomes the infamous Prince John and later King John. So those are their three most famous children. They had a few others. Eleanor even plotted with Richard to overthrow his dad. This is a woman who's not a docile, stay-at-home woman. She had political acumen, and she knew how to strategize. And even when their coup failed, she managed to talk her way out of getting executed. When Richard did inherit the throne eventually, the natural way, she became the Queen Dowager and was also recognized as regent while Richard went on the Third Crusades. Eleanor of Aquitaine is arguably one of the most successful female political leaders in all of European history. The only person I think that comes close might be Elizabeth the Great of England. Speaking of Elizabeths, in Spanish, you would pronounce Elizabeth Isabella. Isabella, the Queen of Castile and Leon, she inherited the throne from her her idiot brother who was spending money and ringing up debts. When she became the reigning Queen of Castile and Leon, she managed to reform the finances. She stabilized the country. She then decided to marry one of her rivals, Ferdinand II of Aragon, but in the marriage documents, she preserved her own sovereignty. So she was the sovereign queen of Castile and Leon, while her husband Ferdinand was the sovereign king of Aragon, and they ruled as, quote, the Catholic majesties of Spain. But it was a Spain didn't exist. Spain was just a creation of their marriage, and then eventually Spain became a political reality and was unified in the person of their grandson, Charles I. Isabella and Ferdinand are known for a lot of negative things in history nowadays. The Reconquista, the Inquisition, and the funding of Christopher Columbus. Some of those, the Inquisition in particular, are highly controversial, negative events. The Reconquista, matter of perspective. It's I think the Spanish and the Portuguese think, and most Western Europeans think it's a good thing. The Moors, the Sephardic Jews have a different perspective. And then obviously Christopher Columbus is controversial as well. But it's worth noting again, here's a person who ruled. When Columbus originally came and asked for money from the Catholic majesties, he was turned down. It was Isabella who reached back out and said, well, maybe we'll do this. She changed history. She ruled. Catherine de' Medici may have just been a woman who brought a dowry to a marriage. She could have, history could have gone down that path where we wouldn't even know who Catherine de' Medici was. However, she married the King of France, and then the King of France died. She had given birth to multiple sons, and so it was up to her as Queen Mother and Queen Regent to protect France for her children. Her sons all died. She outlived two of her sons. She was in a situation where her family was dying. Her family was leading a country. Therefore, from her perspective, her country's falling apart. And this is in the midst of the French religious wars. She rallied the Catholic forces to fight the Huguenot forces. She had to actually hold off even more conservative Catholics who wanted to do even more damage, she thought, to the throne. She was the ruler behind the scenes during what becomes known as the War of Three Henries. Catherine de' Medici put it all in line. Again, like Isabella, some of her decisions and choices are highly controversial. Most people, most historians believe she's behind the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. I would say two things. First of all, if she was, it's still within the paradigm of here's a queen widow who's also a queen mother and a queen regent trying to preserve her country. I have no problem like holding her responsible if she is responsible, but I also feel that we always have to remember that little bit of doubt, because when women are powerful, rumors start. So it could be equally possible somebody else fermented the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and she has been blamed for it in history. Either narrative would be understandable to me. Across the English Channel, back to England, we have the two Tudor princesses, right? They both become great in their own right, in different ways and with different ideologies. It's when Henry VIII dies and the throne is passed to his young son, skipping over the girls that are older, chauvinistic, patriarchal perspectives that women can't rule, these older women are passed over for their younger, sickly brother. Edward rules basically in name only. The Seymour brothers actually rule as regents for him. And when he becomes the age of majority, in my opinion, it's really suspicious that he dies not too long after that. And this mysterious will that designates the cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who's a minor, as the new queen, has sketch written all over it, doesn't it? That the Seymour brothers perhaps thought that they could rule through Lady Jane Grey. Perhaps they were going to marry Lady Jane Grey and claim the throne for themselves. But regardless, the fact that the Catholic older princess, Mary, who spent most of her life in a castle prison with her mother, being told by her mother to follow the one true faith of Catholicism and to be prepared for her job of re-Catholicizing England. When she hears her brother's dead, she and all of the Catholic lords in England, they're behind the gates of London before the Seymour brothers could close the gates. She seizes the city, she seizes the Seymours, she seizes her cousin, Lady Jane Grey, and she executes them. She's not going to put up with any political rivals. She executes her brother's uncles, she executes her cousin, and she claims the throne for herself and goes on to try to re-Catholicize England, earning her the nickname from Protestants later, the name Bloody Mary. Here's a woman who ruled and who also, again, whether it be we undermine women's female rulers by their sexuality, or we undermine them by their intelligence, right? And she's, by calling somebody a Bloody Mary, there's almost like saying that they're unreasonable in their bloodthirst, right? Was Queen Mary any less bloody than her father Henry VIII before her, or her sister Queen Elizabeth after her? I'm not sure, but I would say that if she's so bloody and so hell bent on killing people who aren't Catholic, it's kind of interesting. There's a pretty important person who's not Catholic that she never kills, her sister Elizabeth. She knows that she has to keep her sister Elizabeth alive, regardless of their religious differences, because her sister is her heir. Eventually, her sister does inherit, and she becomes Elizabeth the First of England, Elizabeth the Great. She uses her sexuality and her availability or eligibility as a potential marriage partner to hold Spain at bay until she can stabilize England enough that she's prepared to take on the what becomes the Spanish invasion, the Spanish Armada. She plays and develops this ethos of English nationalism over English religious division and warfare. She rules long enough to stabilize the country in ways that her sister, her brother, and certainly not her father ever could. She did everything that any father or ancestor, whether it be a political ancestor or a familial ancestor, she does anything, she does everything that you would want in an heir. And the irony, of course, is that Henry VIII only wanted boys, and his two princesses wound up doing far more than his heir ever did, his boy. Another interesting situation where there was a question of inheritance would be Maria Theresa. Her father had a daughter, and under the laws at the time, it was not allowed for Maria Theresa to inherit. And so he made this political deal, this diplomatic agreement called the Pragmatic Sanction, which allowed Maria Theresa to inherit the throne with the assumption that when she got married and had children, her children would then, whether she was alive or not, would become the rulers. So on paper, she ruled with her two sons, never actually giving them political power. She controlled German Austria for decades. She promoted commerce, developed agriculture. She reorganized what had been a questionable military, all of which strengthened Austria's international prestige and standing. Nearby, you have a German princess, Princess Sophie, who becomes betrothed to the Tsar of Russia, Peter III, and makes a deal with the boyars, the Russian nobles, to overthrow her own husband. And she claims the throne of all Russia in her own right. A German princess overthrows the Russian Tsar, her husband, and then the German princess rules Russia and rules Russia so well that she's known as Catherine the Great of Russia. And yet you go to Google and you type in Catherine of Russia. If you put in Catherine of Russia space and you type in the word, type in the word sex or death, immediately you see these urban legends and rumors that have been around for hundreds of years, and they're not true because she was so powerful and successful. People undermine her by questioning her sexuality in ways that men never face. Catherine the Great was great. This last century, this century really of the expression and the explosion in parliamentary democracies and presidential republics and such that are true republics, not these authoritarian strongman states that where they claim to be presidents. But we had several really powerful, amazing female strategists and politicians in the last century. Golda Meir, in fact, the first woman to be known as the Iron Lady. She was Israel's first female prime minister. She led the country in a national unity government during the Six-Day War. She presided over the development of the modern Israeli Labor Party. She is somebody who was both before prime minister, she was the minister, the foreign minister as well. And while she was foreign minister and when she was prime minister, she worked for peace. She laid out a deal that to be accepted by the UN and to be accepted by Richard Nixon. She was looking for peace, but not compromising the sovereignty and safety of her own country. Golda Meir ruled. And then there's the second Iron Lady, the other Iron Lady, right? Margaret Thatcher, who, I mean, politically, I certainly disagree with a lot of her politics, but you cannot take away the fact that she was the longest serving prime minister of the century. You can't take away the fact that she transformed the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom into the modern party that it is. Her uncompromising politics, her fiery leadership style, her ability to build partnerships and relationships, personal relationships with President Reagan, her ability to manipulate Argentina and spur the Falkland Islands War that she then could call a snap election to reassert her own power in Britain by increasing her parliamentary majorities. This is a woman who knew how to play politics. This is a woman who ruled. Across the Irish Sea in Ireland, the decade later or so, was Mary Robinson, elected president as an independent, not belonging to either of the major political parties. As president, she transformed what had been basically I don't want, no, lame duck isn't the right word, but like a symbolic office of president. The power really belongs to the Taoiseach, right? And so Mary Robinson transformed the role and the prestige of the office of President of Ireland into a leadership role. As president, she presided over her government's, the Doyle's participation in the Good Friday Agreement. But she also, perhaps more important than anything else, she visited Queen Elizabeth of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. She visited Elizabeth in London at Buckingham Palace, which laid the groundwork for a decade later or so, the Queen to make that amazing historic 2011 trip to Ireland and to visit and lay a wreath at the 1916 Easter Rising Memorial. After her term as president, interestingly, Ireland is the only country in the world where a female head of state was succeeded by another female head of state. But when Mary Robinson did step down as president, she became the High Commissioner for the Human Rights for the United Nations, and she has worked for human rights and been very controversial, criticizing the United States for its racism and as well as other countries for human rights violations and discrimination. Here's a woman who's not afraid to rule. In Africa, perhaps one of the most important elections in all of African history, the election of Ellen Johnson. When Ellen Johnson was elected president of Liberia, the first truly democratically elected president of Africa, and also, therefore, the first elected female head of state in Africa, she transformed a country that had been torn by ethnic divisions and human rights violations, the disgusting reign of Charles Taylor. She rebuilt Liberia. She built partnerships in the world. She even tried to check the power of Goodyear and other rubber companies, multinational companies that had bought up and basically effectively controlled Liberia. She stood up to international MNCs. She stood up for human rights. She participated in and facilitated the trial, the ultimate international trial of Charles Taylor. And she was awarded the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize with two others. And all three of those women recognized for protecting women's rights in peace building processes. Ellen Johnson is the real deal. And Angela Merkel, how long has she been the Chancellor of Germany? I don't think anybody can even remember easily another German chancellor. Perhaps Helmut Kohl is the only other one that comes to mind. Merkel's been described as the de facto leader of Europe, the most powerful woman in the world, and the leader of the free world. Angela Merkel has ruled and led Germany almost for 2 decades. And she's navigated political crisis after political crisis. Angela Merkel is a woman who rules. Finally, and somewhat controversially, not somewhat, controversially, we have Aung San Suu Kyi. As a dissident, she was an amazing political leader that we all could look up to. She got the Nobel Peace Prize because of her commitment to nonviolent resistance in Burma or Myanmar, whatever you want to call it. And then, unfortunately, since becoming head of state, first her title is state counselor, she has, in a sense, betrayed her international supporters, and I would say she's betrayed her values. However, at the same time, you could also say she's being Machiavellian. She wants to be state counselor. She wants to lead Burma into presumably the development of more democratic mechanisms and institutions, but she's keeping her mouth pretty quiet about the persecution of the Rohingya people. To me, that's a betrayal of her Nobel Peace Prize, and perhaps it should be revoked. But she's also preserving her position as state counselor, because maybe if she stood up to the military and criticized their persecution of the Rohingya, she would be overthrown. This Burma's a state that's been led by a military junta for decades. Is her recalcitrance to speaking out based on the belief that she can build a better Burma slowly, or is it out of ego and fear of keeping her power? We don't know. But she is a woman who rules. These 20 women are women that I look up to, with my asterisks that I've mentioned. But I respect the fact that they were able to play a game that was so dominated by male politicians, whether they be, elected or hereditary. These are women who were able to play, quote unquote, a man's game in a man's world. And if you want more information, there's an interesting book out by Claudia Gold. It's History's 50 Most Remarkable Women. Many of those are in my list of 20, not all of them, but they're well worth the read. A couple of honorable mentions I'd like to just throw out there too, though. Maybe it's my bias, I am Irish, but Boudica, the great British Celtic queen who led the uprising against the Roman Empire in 60 ACE, how many people successfully even organized an uprising, let alone succeeded? I don't think any succeeded. But if we all know Spartacus, how come we don't know Boudica as well? I think there's a gender bias, probably also an ethnic bias, because Spartacus being, I think he was Thracian, but from the classical world, right? That he was a Thracian slave from Greece who lived in Italy and rose up against the Roman Empire, fits the narrative of this, like these two super great countries, Greece and Rome. Whereas Boudica, most people don't remember that the British were originally Celtic before they became Romano-British and then eventually Anglo-Saxon Jute. Oh my! So Boudica, we need to recognize her place in history. Or the great pirate queen, Grace O'Malley. My daughter is named after her. The fact that O'Malley was able to inherit her dad's position as head of the clan, the fact that even when she was married twice, she has two sons from those two marriages and still ruled, and her sons worked for her. She didn't just go out and become what we would call in most Western countries a queen dowager. She didn't go and retire and let her sons inherit the clan. She ruled. And in fact, as she extended her power base in Connaught, and Queen Elizabeth of England was extending British, at that point, English power in Ireland, the two clashed. And when her family members were taken prisoner by I said British again, the English, she demanded that they be returned to her. And Queen Elizabeth famously invited her to London. Grace O'Malley, the pirate queen, voluntarily goes to London to meet Elizabeth to demand her family members back. She refused to curtsy in front of the queen, to the offense of all of the courtesans there. Allegedly, she even brought a dagger with her and hid it in her dress. The Grace O'Malley only spoke Irish and Latin. Queen Elizabeth only spoke English and Latin. So these two great, powerful women in history having a conversation in Latin because neither one spoke the native tongue of the other. And then this last part is more of an urban legend, but apparently Grace O'Malley sneezed. She was given a lace kerchief to clean herself, and she used it and then threw it into the fire. And everybody was offended, like, "How dare you throw away this expensive piece of lace?" And Grace O'Malley's response was something to the effect of, "Why would you want to keep that?" Grace O'Malley, she's a woman who ruled. And finally, my third honorable mention is this mistress of John of Gaunt. In fact, she was his mistress for decades. John of Gaunt, who becomes the founder of the House of Lancaster, was married twice before he finally married his mistress, Catherine Swifford. And when they did get married finally, they had several children, but one of them had a child who had a child who had a child who had a child. And 22 generations later, would be my wife, Colleen Marie Turner Keefe. So Catherine of Swifford, she ruled, but I think Colleen Keefe, she rules too. These are my 20 heroines of history with a couple of honorable mentions. Thanks for listening. I'm the Babbling Professor.